Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Sensemaker Live in partnership with Santander. Thrilled you could all join us for what I think is going to be a very interesting hour of discussion. The subject of the Sensemaker Live today is American culture and values, is the dream dead? A subject which is always interesting but has a particular poignancy and resonance in view of what's about to happen next week, or perhaps what's not about to happen. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot in the hour that follows. In fact, just before we went live, I was confiding in our speakers that I actually had a proper literal dream that Donald Trump won a second term last week, which really did not do much for my morning. But the subject of our thinking today is a bit broader than just Trump and even Trumpism, and it's an attempt to get under the skin of what the American dream represents, whether it's real, whether it's been corroded, and so on. We have a fantastic group of speakers. We have Lauren Gambino, who's a political correspondent to The Guardian US, and if you have any interest in American politics and American culture, she's a must-read. Davies OBE, who's former deputy head of mission to the USA and a
Bear with us a second. We seem to have lost Matt. Ella, are you okay to step in just now?
Yes, I'm happy to. I think that we could probably start off by talking to Patrick, if that's okay, and bringing you in on what you think about our discussion today. I mean, it's a big question. Is the dream dead? Is this sort of the end of what we saw as, you know, American culture being this great sort of bastion of truth and justice and democracy, or is that overblown, do you think?
Thanks, Ella. Yeah, it is a big question, but I mean, I'd like to be optimistic and say I don't think the dream is dead, but it's probably on life support and maybe being treated with bleach as we speak. But more seriously, no, I genuinely don't think it's dead, but I think it's under serious strain. And I think it's important to say that, you know, it would be very easy to focus this conversation all around Donald Trump in the last 4 years, but actually, from my perspective, the challenges America is facing go much deeper than that. Donald Trump is a symptom of problems in America. He's not the cause. And I think if he does lose next week in the election on Tuesday, and let's see what happens, but if he does lose, I think it would be all too easy for Americans to say, we've got rid of this, we can now move on and society will come back together and we can all live the American dream again. And I think that would be a huge mistake and a massive missed opportunity for the US to actually address some of the very fundamental problems it's facing. And those are everything from the state of its democracy, where spend any time looking into American democracy, and it's questionable in many ways, to say the least, with voter suppression, gerrymandering, the electoral college skewing with the presidential election results, the economy that doesn't deliver for Americans now, for a vast number of Americans now, and a declining American dream in its broadest sense, with opportunity for people to improve their lot actually decreasing rather than increasing. So there's a lot to do, but I don't think it's all about Trump.
Thanks for that, Patrick. I think we have Matt back.
I'm back in the room.
Excellent.
Apologise very much. The Zoom gremlins got me. So just to resume what I was saying about it, if you'd like to join in, please do contribute to the chat box, or if you want to draw your attention to me directly, raise your hand by clicking on the participants key and then click raise hand, and I will be able to come to you. Just to sort of frame the debate quickly, I mean, it seems to me that last night I watched a documentary about Hunter S. Thompson's bid to become Sheriff of Aspen in 1970. And what was interesting was that he, although for all his image as a sort of dissolute cynic, definitely had a view of the dream. And it seems to me there are all sorts of versions of this dream embedded in the Constitution, in the notion of frontier culture, the sort of Great Gatsby notion of unimaginable wealth, the civil rights notion of turning the nightmare of slavery and its legacy into the vision of Martin Luther King, and many other species. And it seems to me that undeniable that all of these versions of the dream, what they have in common is that they've been violated and in some cases seriously damaged by Trump in the last 4 years, in isolationism, division, unapologetic support for white supremacists, the Muslim ban, the opposition to science, the vindictiveness, the polarization, and a sense that if it ever was a frontier society, it's shrinking. So they've all the versions of the dream seem to me to be under attack. But Daryl, I wanted to come to you and ask you, first of all, what your understanding of the American dream and the culture and values it does or should represent is, and the extent to which it's been corroded in recent years.
I would agree with Patrick Davies that the problems go back a long time before Trump. You could even argue that some of the things we're facing now are part of our founding traditions. Certainly in the Constitution itself, there is some anxiety about the popular vote in and of itself, and wishing to sort of put up institutions that temper direct democracy. And I suppose you could say it's always worked in that we accept the compromises for results we don't like and things like that. I don't think that the, whatever you call the dream, no, let's call it the dream. It's not dead, but it comes, a lot has happened around it, but not to it. The reason everyone is anxious about this election in other parts of the world is because of what the United States of America still represents as a political experiment, a social experiment, this kind of reality, and the attacks going on against its power, both within and without. What is happening in America means so many different things depending on where you are in the world. For me, the great tragedy of the last 40 years has been the attack on liberalism. It's been sort of constant, just as it was, an analogy would be the attack on the EU in the UK. You keep going on and on and on about what a villain it is, sooner or later, too many people will believe you. No matter what strict constitutionalists and the Federalist Society and people like that say, the Constitution works best when it is interpreted as a liberal document that is always broadening the chances for inclusion and participation in the society and the political culture. Our biggest problem is the concentration of money in politics. From Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that said a corporation could be treated as an individual. This is insane. And down to the local level, where, for instance, in Ferguson, Missouri, when I went there and talked to the one Black person on the city council, she said she was only on the council because her husband supported her determination to take part. Otherwise, the only people who could afford to be on the council were people who already had a lot of money, because the $14,000 a year was not a salary anyone could live on. And so on the one hand, you don't want a professional political class, but on the other hand, the only people who can take part in government on a local or state level are people who are not hurt by doing so. So I think that money is the reform we still haven't addressed: campaign financing, super PACs. Very little legislation is actually written in Washington anymore. It's written by lobbyists who then come and sort of remind representatives that you owe us, things like that. So I think that also we're seeing a struggle between forces of influence and people who want their influence back. I think that in a way that's mostly what this election is about, even though everything else is swirling around. I mean, there are many things to keep saying, but I'll let someone else come in there.
Just before
my feeling is it's not dead, but we must sort of take it seriously and then remember that it doesn't stop once the election is over. The opposition, when they passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the opposition to it began immediately and it never stopped. And when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, they did so with arguments that they had formulated in 1965. So opposition to the liberal dream is constant. And we forget that defense of it must be constant also.
Do you think, Daryl, that the unspeakable...
I really hate seeing myself on screen when I talk. It makes it hard to
no,
for what I'm saying, you know, it's like,
I feel the same about
this clown.
You look just fine.
That's not what I meant. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
The unspeakable spectacle of George Floyd's lynching in May, a moment that, you know, was seen around the world, and it's a sort of fortuitous set of circumstances because of the pandemic, and the sense that we were all in this strange limbo, was all that anyone was watching, and it was impossible for people, as they had in many preceding instances of police brutality, averted their gaze. And this triggered a movement, a moment and a movement around the world in protest. And I wonder, from that atrocity, whether you're able to derive some hope about moving forward this, you know, central issue that no American dream is possible, that not only excludes a large proportion of the American population, but also violates their right to exist. There is at least a shred of a possibility that some progress might be made now.
I think that that was such a generational expression, a moment where, because of the lockdown, and then seeing what had happened in Minneapolis, the young people simply exploded and refused to leave the streets. And then it communicated itself. It owes a lot to Occupy Wall Street and the G7 demonstrations in the 90s. But this was something else, something much larger. It may have had the effect of registering many, many new voters, many, many young voters. We've been waiting and waiting for the youth vote to show up, and maybe this time they will. I think that certainly the pandemic and the kind of captive audience made the difference. I've never watched the whole thing through, I can't myself, but it certainly made a difference and made that seemed to be very galvanizing moment. But it's also the context for it had changed so much. The one thing identity politics did not foresee was, you know, if you're not the norm, then if white isn't the norm, then it's another identity. So we're also watching a struggle over what whiteness means. It's just not sort of really phrased that way, but that's what Trump's supporters are trying to say, that, you know, it still means this, this, and that, and it doesn't. They no more than I live in the country where we grew up, and we live in a country that's much more like the rest of the world. And this is a deep trauma for the United States, to sort of lose its sense of being unique and a guiding light.
Lauren, can I come to you? You know, you're someone who is constantly, you know, on the beat, reporting, analysing, assessing, considering what's going on in the here and now. And I'm intrigued to find out what you know when you think of American cultural values, and particularly the notion of the American dream. Is it an idea that you take seriously? And if so, is it one that in happier times could be revived?
I think it's interesting because, especially when you look at it through the lens of a political campaign, the American dream is something that both sides use as sort of a framing for their own candidacies, that they embody somehow this American dream, and that's why the American people should support them, because they represent this and they will deliver it for you as well. And I think you know, we saw this very clearly in 2016, and we're seeing this again. I think this idea of I think on the one hand you have Donald Trump, who believes and showing his supporters that perhaps the American dream is a zero-sum game and only some of you will have access to it. And Joe Biden is trying to put forward this idea that everyone should have access. You can, you know, there's different versions, there's different variations, and it can mean something different to different people, but ultimately it's broader than that. And I think in that sense, Trump has actually been almost illuminating, because he's so clear. There's no dog whistles, and often in American politics, when you touch on issues of culture, which are also issues of race, then you have these dog whistles, and it's hard to sort of say clearly what candidates are trying to say and who they're trying to appeal to. But Trump has been very clear, and we've seen over and over again that he is speaking to an increasingly small section of America, a white Christian, you know, longtime male-dominated section of the country, and that is, you know, becoming much smaller. And even in just 4 years, we've seen his share of the electorate. It's gotten smaller. It's an older share. So there's some, you know, just some sort of numbers. Obviously, if he's attracting older voters, but also, you know, younger people now are multicultural, biracial, multiracial, and so I think, you know, in 2016 it was interesting because Hillary Clinton really embraced that. She went, her slogan was "Better Together," and I think Trump was able to play to those fears that maybe we're not better together, that somehow by becoming a more liberal and open society, we are, you, my supporters, are losing out on something. I think this time around, though, after 4 years of Trumpism, I think you're seeing, you're at least seeing sort of a marshaling of support, because in 2016 we did see drops in African-American turnout, Latino turnout remained sort of low, and young people as well. And given that that's sort of the future of what America will look like, we are seeing signs early on so far that these constituencies are turning out.
It's interesting because, you know, historically there's always been ebb and flow in the various ways in which America is expansive. So there have been periods of foreign policy isolation and periods of huge foreign policy interventionism. There have been periods when the incumbent president has claimed to speak on behalf of the silent majority against what is presented as the dissident minority, thinking of Nixon. There have been periods when, you know, there's presidents and administrations have been more or less hospitable to immigration, and so on and so on. But I think particularly now, a sort of hostility to science and to and to the Enlightenment inheritance. What's interesting about this moment is that Trump seems to me to be retreating from all of them. That even as he claims to be making America great again, which is not a new slogan, but his use of it really it seems to be that in practice it involves diminution. You know, he's retreating and taking with him his overwhelmingly white older voters into a kind of fortified area, and blaming all the country's problems on everyone else overseas, but also at home. And this is what makes the moment unique, in that we're kind of we're watching America shrink before our very eyes.
Well, we watched it expand before our very eyes once Barack Obama stepped into the White House. So, yes. And also the isolationism in American foreign policy is a very old tradition.
Yes.
Woodrow Wilson got a lot of flack for his ambitions in World War I and the League of Nations, and it made everyone even more anti involvement. The ocean kept the United States away from all those destructive problems elsewhere in the world. And we were two oceans. This was the fortress. We didn't need walls. We had weak Mexico, friendly Canada, and two oceans. And so, even in 1940, Americans didn't want to get into the war. It's very much a post-war thing, and an effect of the Cold War, of having to meet communist threat wherever it appeared, and it had a lot of economic benefits for American business and on that sort of thing. But it did sort of, when it got to Vietnam, sort of put various forces in confrontation. After the draft was eliminated and middle-class kids were no longer a threat, the character of the military changed very much. And it's now a sort of poor person's way out of to get an education and a job is to join the military. So that's changed very much. So the expansion of the US and the military was, it all sort of went together in the post-war period. I think that Trump's biggest problem is, of course, he never expected to win. And so, the only thing that runs Washington now is opportunism and this kind of determined to reverse anything Obama did. He sort of, as time went on, let in all sorts of people who had various sort of plans. So he put in charge of every department the one person who would destroy that department. When he was his first year, if you called a number in Washington, the phone rang and rang and rang because he simply emptied out, fired 70,000 people from the State Department, things like that. So there was no one in the world at an American bureau who knew what was sort of going on anywhere. He just really didn't like experts or anything like that, and could sort of lead by inspiration the same way he did his businesses. Well, we know he's a bad businessman. So that was a bad sort of plan anyway. And the anti-science, everything comes from this not liking experts. And you can sort of whip up this populist resentment of experts by presenting it as another kind of liberalism that's going to tell you what to do when you don't want to do it that way. It's sort of always demonizing planning, social engineering, coalitions, collectives, anything that would help us sort of move forward, and that would challenge these hierarchical relationships that have run U.S. society from the very beginning, openly or not so openly. So, you know, he's in defense of something that doesn't work anymore. And this is the great tragedy of what's going on, that people are trying to hang on to something that doesn't work. At the same time, that Chinese proverb, everyone will give a shove to a tumbling wall. I don't know why people say that they are disenchanted with government. It's just something that, you know, we say. But the one thing the pandemic has shown is how necessary central government is in order to cope with the things coming to us that we've never experienced before. So, you know.
So
I don't know if I made any sense, but.
Absolutely. No, and Lauren, just come back to you. You know, when you've been covering this election, and of course it's a long old haul from the primaries through to polling day. It seems to me that Biden has very successfully made it a referendum on Trump, and that's probably the smart move, given how much material he has to deal with. You know, strategically very sensible in order to bring together as many, you know, coalition of voters to get rid of Trump. But have you observed, detected, alongside that, you know, the urgency of getting rid of Trump, a spirit of optimism? You know, because if you know, to Daryl's point, in 2008, there was I was there a bit, and there was an amazing sense of potential change. You know, Obama was a galvanic candidate. He was extraordinary. Now Biden's very different, but is there a sense that out of this will come more than the eviction of Trump, and that there is actually grounds for optimism?
I think there's a lot of grounds for optimism that I'm hearing from voters. I don't think it stems from Joe Biden at all. He's not really the kind of candidate that inspires voters. But that being said, there is so much energy in the electorate, and it's been building for 4 years. I think you have to go back to the Women's March, which was followed by you know, gun control protests led by kids, climate protests led by kids. Then it was then we had the Me Too movement, which is still ricocheting through, you know, business and across industry, and then now you have, you know, sort of this. The Black Lives Matter movement has been here for a long time, but this sort of just, you know, now suddenly everyone, well, white people having more of a reckoning of and joining Black Lives Matter and young people in the streets. And so I think that buildup has given a lot of people hope and optimism. You know, Barack Obama himself, he's back on the trail. And, you know, you'd think if there was anyone who lost hope, it would be someone like him, who was succeeded by someone who questioned his very citizenship. But he actually said, you know, just seeing the protests and people in the streets has been really, you know, just really hopeful. I also think there's been this sort of enlightenment. You know, I think it's easy to go about your day-to-day life and not really understand how your local government or how the mail works. And suddenly, I mean, you know, for reasons that are alarming, suddenly people are paying attention to how the mail works, how you vote, what the electoral college system is. Is this the best way of doing, you know, of electing a president? And so there's a lot of, I think, introspection about just the everyday democratic institutions that I think people probably didn't think about very much 4 years ago. You know, granted, this is happening on sort of one side of the aisle because it is still an incredibly tribal and partisan moment, but I still think, if you'll indulge me, I'm from Arizona. It's a state that is currently a battleground state this cycle. It's really in flux. But you know, about 3 or 4 decades ago, we elected this sheriff, and he was sort of a mini prototype of Donald Trump. And he was bombastic, a showman. He locked up prisoners in a tent he called a concentration camp, and in the scorching summer heat. So he kind of was a precursor to Donald Trump. Donald Trump would later pardon him. But the same night that Donald Trump was elected, he was ousted after a quarter century in power. And I think that's an example of how this new generation is rising up. It was activism and activists and young people who ousted him. And now this cycle, we're seeing the same state that's been traditionally Republican for decades, possibly going to send a second Democratic senator to the Senate and possibly will elect Joe Biden. So I think these changes are slow and they're slow coming, but I would say the last 4 years has given activists and young people a lot of reason for hope.
It's very, very interesting. Patrick, if I can come back to you, I mean, you have a very interesting loss in this as a Brit who knows America intimately. You know, you are the Englishman who in Washington, so to speak, and you've seen it in all sorts of capacities. As a sort of outsider, but with an insider's perspective, so to speak, did you feel, particularly when you were a diplomat there, that the dream was anything more than a slogan? Did it have real adhesive meaning in the making of policy, the formulation of governmental strategy, in the way ordinary citizens operated, or was it, as it were, a great bumper sticker just stuck across the continent?
I mean, I think the concept of the American dream is based in reality. It's based in historic reality, and it's, you look back to a time when America was a very young nation. It was expanding west and offering all sorts of opportunity to many people from all over the world, and that wasn't without its trials and tribulations. And we don't need to go today into how the Americans at the time treated the indigenous population and all those sorts of things. So it's a complicated history, but it was one of a new, young, expanding country finding great wealth in a nation and capitalizing on that. And many people did extremely well. So there's the historic background to the American dream. Now, whether it's true now is a very big question, and I think there's lots of evidence to suggest it isn't true anymore. Somebody in the chat put about social mobility. Social mobility in the US is declining, and it's now lower than many parts of Europe, including, believe it or not, in the UK, where if you spoke to lots of Americans even now, they'd say your class society means that you are so socially immobile. Well, actually, we're more socially mobile than the US now. So there's all sorts of pointers saying the dream is under severe duress. But a point Daryl made earlier about the sort of sense of uniqueness of America, what America means, the American dream and all that. I mean, what I've just been writing about in my book is the very fact, I think this is one of the fundamental problems around why America has got to the place it's got to now, and that is the sort of belief in this mythology around what America is. Lauren talked about politicians who on the campaign train right now are saying that they are the embodiment of the American dream. There are slightly different definitions of it, but they will deliver the American dream and make sure it's there for everybody else. And this sort of unquestioning belief that America is unique, I think, stops people looking at the fundamental problems underlying the situation in America, its politics and its economics and so on, because they think that America is in this unique position compared to everybody else. And that may have been true at some time in its history, as I say, when America was this young, expanding nation. But it's not so true now. And the way I look at it, if you like, is, there's a lot of talk about startup companies now and how you scale a startup company to be successful. Well, when a company is a little idea, or when a country is a little idea and growing, it's relatively easy to continue having success. But once you get to a certain level of maturity, and I mean that in terms of age, not in terms of behaviors, once you get to a certain age as a country, and you're basically an established nation where your borders are fixed and you know what your resources are and your population is growing, how you behave as a country has to change, and your systems that you need to operate as a country have to adapt. And the sort of this growth of constitutional originalism in the US, that you know the Constitution cannot be touched and it has to be interpreted as it was meant to be in the 1700s, is an example of this. And as Daryl said, I mean, that, you know, if America is to survive, in my view, and to progress and to continue to thrive, it needs to look hard at those original documents and say, are they still relevant to the American day? And if they're not, which I think in some ways they are not, they need to adapt. And if they don't adapt, America will continue to decline. That's guaranteed. Doesn't mean that the dream is over, but America has to do a certain amount of things to make sure that the dream stays on track.
Can I stick with you, Patrick, for a minute, because you've lit upon a subject which I think is absolutely core to the whole debate, which is you can't spend any time in America without realizing, you know, most countries on earth have a codified constitution. That's not odd, but very few of them attach as much significance to their codified constitution as America does. It's, you know, it is the founding text, and you know, its flaws are quite clear. You know, it was written by white men, and it excluded huge sections of the population, and the amendments to it have tried, and to some extent succeeded, in other respects conspicuously failed to fill those, to address those problems. But you kind of make me wonder whether one of the problems with modern American exceptionalism is rooted in this belief that the Constitution is a sort of, you know, reliable bedrock. And, you know, one of the things that we've learned in the last 4 years, and in the Federalist Papers, you know, you can see the worries of the founding fathers that there might arise a president who just didn't take notice of the rules. And so I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded way of putting this, but is part of the problem this, as you call it, this originalism, this fixation with the Constitution?
I think that's part of it, but I think as I said, I think it's broader than that. I think it's an obsession with Americans' uniqueness, and you know that. I tell a story in the book about when I went to an event where this is post-Obama, just in the early days of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, who I have a lot of respect for as a politician. I think he's, if I had a right to vote, that's who I'd be voting for. But you know, he was at an event where he was speaking, and I ended up introducing him. I'm not entirely sure why even now. It was at a young student organization based in Washington, DC, which students from all over the world could come and live in this environment and exchange ideas. So a very positive place. And in his speech in that event, accepting their award, he talked about everybody coming to America, still wanting to come to America because there was no ethnic conflict. Everybody had the chance to make it, and this great American dream that still existed. And I was really taken aback by that, by somebody who'd been in office, who was a senior politician, peddling the sort of the mythology around what America is. Now, it's great to have aspiration, and all countries need that. You all need something to head towards and aspire to be. But I think the problem across America is this sense that because they're unique, that there isn't a fundamental debate about the issues going on in the country. Now, of course, there's debate. There's lots of people talking about the challenges there are in America. But as soon as you put your politicians out campaigning for office, it's back to this American mythology. And I think there's a problem there in terms of allowing America to address those problems in a real sense that they need to do.
I'd like it now, if I may, to turn to my colleague Patricia Clarke, who's got a series of slides which I think will, I hope, illuminate some of the things we've been talking about. Over to you, Patricia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. Can everyone see the slides? No, there we go. So when we're talking about American culture and values, as you said, Matt, the obvious starting point, or the thing that comes to mind, is the US Constitution, and its aim was to, quote unquote, form a more perfect union of the people. But of course, what we're currently seeing in the States is that voters are incredibly polarized. So when it comes to issues that voters deem very important in this election, we're seeing a staggering 57-point difference between Trump and Biden supporters when it comes to climate change, a 52-point difference when it comes to issues about race and ethnic inequality, even or especially after the death of George Floyd. But there's even a 43-point difference when it comes to COVID, which we're still in the grips of. So I think this shows the extent of the social divide in the country. But one thing voters can agree on is the importance of Supreme Court appointments. It's quite easy to focus on the fact that Trump has appointed 3 out of 9 of the Supreme Court justices during his presidency, which is obviously remarkable because he's only had a single term in office. But it's equally important to look at Trump's impact on all levels of the courts of the United States. The Senate has confirmed 220 Article 3 judges nominated by Trump, which is a quarter of the current judiciary. This is the fastest first-time expansion of any president except for Jimmy Carter, under whom the courts were being expanded to deal with a larger volume of work, which is why he was able to appoint so many people. 85% of Trump's appointed US attorneys are white men, compared with 58% in Barack Obama's 8 years. And as a reminder, white men make up a third of the US population. So this is a legacy that could extend for a generation. Each judge has a life term. These people will be making decisions on behalf of the American people for years to come. If we could go to the next slide, please. And of course, the killing of George Floyd reinvigorated discussion around racial inequality in America. Many people called this an awakening, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement and the subsequent protests. And of course, Trump very much tried to downplay the role of racism in George Floyd's death and everything that followed. He refused to, quote unquote, label tens of millions of Americans racist or bigots. And now what we're seeing is that it wasn't an awakening for everyone. So, when asked the same question in 2016 and 2020, do you believe that it's a lot more difficult to be a Black person in this country than it is to be a white person? Democrats were 30% more likely to say yes this time around. Meanwhile, Trump voters were 2% less likely to say yes to the same question. Next slide, please. And this is something we touched on earlier. One thing that really surprised me in my research is that, actually, contrary to popular belief, trust in science has remained relatively steady in America since the 1960s. If anything, it's slightly on the rise at the moment. But you see so many anti-science stories in the media. I'm thinking of anti-vaxxers and climate change deniers and so on. And what we can see in these charges is that it's, again, a partisan issue. Across the board, there's an increase in people who believe that climate change is a major threat to the US, but there's still nearly 3 times as many Democrats and Republicans who feel this way. And the rate of change is much bigger. Likewise, when it comes to questions like vaccinations, we can see a clear party divide across all generations, with Republicans being much less likely to take a vaccine if it becomes available, although, to be honest, it's pretty low on both sides. Yeah, and the final slide, we started this talking about the US Constitution. I'd like to end it on the topic of democracy. People often say that it's really the foundation on which America is built. When you think of freedom and the rights of the people and all those constitutional values, you think of democracy. But this study from 2020 found that dissatisfaction with democracy is at a record high, 58%. This is backed up by another 2018 American Institutional Confidence Poll, which found that a third of people between the ages of 18 to 29 said that a non-democracy might be better or preferable to a democracy, which I think is staggering. Anti-democratic sentiment in America has shot up in recent years, perhaps unsurprising when you've got a populist president who's threatening democratic systems, who's committing impeachable offenses, who's trying to use emergency powers to build walls. But it does also predate Trump. Social media is driving people's skepticism, and those polled say they feel like their vote won't change anything, or that the courts do not treat people fairly. So I think no matter who wins, I'll be very interested to see what a chart like this will look like in a year. That's it for me.
Thank you, Patricia. That's so interesting and illuminating. Conscious of time marching on, I'd like, if possible, to come to my colleague Nima Omer. Nima, are you around? Are you there? Just trying to see if you're can get you on the screen.
Hi.
How are you, Nima? I was struck by something you said in the chat about, and I'd much rather hear it from you than me, about a generation of activists sort of arising during these times?
Yeah, so over the summer, I actually was talking to a lot of people who were in Minneapolis who were protesting like towards the end of May and start of June, and like just finding people on social media because I was writing a story about it. And what I noticed was a lot of the people who were at these protests who were quite young, like younger than me, late teens, were talking about Jamar Clarke and Philando Castile. And so they were saying that they were at the protests like 5 years ago, like organizing and like with their parents, with friends, like with their community. So it was like, I was just kind of struck by the fact that they were basically children 5 years ago, like 12, 11 years old. And I'm just starting to realize that like there is basically a generation of people who have become radicalized on both sides of the spectrum, as we all know, but have basically been almost equivalent to what we were seeing in the 60s and the 70s. And I don't think we've quite come to realize that right now, because people are literally growing up protesting and being more acutely aware of their politics and the world around them than they ever were before, in a way that like in a very, not just in a social media way or in a digital way, in a very real, material, physical way, where they're going out. And as we saw in Minneapolis, like it quickly descended into like rioting, and like a lot of the people who were involved with that were teenagers they were really young, and they felt compelled, whether you believe it was right or not, to, you know, they felt that there was no other option than to, you know, do that basically. And we can see it on the other side of the spectrum, like I said, with far right, like kids being brought into the far right and the Kenosha shooting and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much. You know, it's a fascinating way of looking at it. And I totally struck by your generational analysis in comparison to the 60s and 70s. Can we go to Paul Lusk, who's written brilliantly for us on this subject? Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Good to see you. Just wondered if you can explore a little bit, you know, under the rubric of values and so on, the connection between not just the Trump phenomenon, but where we're at in America and evangelicalism. And
yeah. Thanks for that. Well, could I just pick up on Xavier's question in the chat, which is about the link between evangelicalism and the American dream?
Please, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So if I could kind of guide people to a fantastic book by Frances Fitzgerald, which came back 3 years ago, called Evangelicalism, The Fight for America, or something like that. But she sees the roots of evangelicalism in the revivals that took place before and after the revolution. So basically, between the revolution and the Civil War, American population grew sixfold. And that was mainly white Protestant immigration from Europe. And that was linked with a whole series of revivals, huge public meetings, so that virtually the whole of white America became evangelical. And that it was very individualistic. It was linked with salesmanship, you know, showmanship. You can see televangelism, all going back to these roots in this version of Christianity, which challenged the earlier form, you know, the Puritan and Catholic and Church of England settlers, who established, you know, they were local established churches. They were Anglican or Congregationalist. They were linked to the local establishment, to the landowners, and this evangelicalism challenged that, and it was it had huge political momentum behind it. But it was split on slavery right from the beginning, because the northern evangelicals saw slavery as a sin and said slaveholding was a sin. In 1780, the Methodists instructed all members to give up slaveholding, and they gave them 3 years to do it, and the South said no. And this evangelicalism was split, and in 1840 it split South and North, all the major evangelical denominations. And this was the roots of the Civil War. Mark Knoll says the Civil War was a war over religion. It was a war over the meaning of the Bible. Daryl's disagreeing with me. Anyway, let me finish. But then after the Civil War, and I really want to come to liberalism, if I may, and I agree with what Daryl said earlier about liberalism. But after the Civil War, for 10 years, the South had black people were becoming senators. They were running the local cities. But then in 1877, only 10 years after the end of the Civil War, the federal government withdrew the Union Army from the South. It was part of a deal over the presidency between the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Republicans were then split. And the faction that supported the continuation of Black liberation, Reconstruction in the South were called the Radicals. And the ones that opposed that and withdrew the army were the liberal Republicans, because liberal meant small state liberalism. So if we then kind of fast forward to now, liberalism now tends to mean woke liberalism. It's linked to the Democrats. The Democrats were the party of big state, of FDR, but also the party of segregation in the South, right? So I think I agree with Daryl, and I think we need a revival of liberalism, but liberalism needs to be restated for modern times, because as Mark Liller says, liberalism has become taken over by identity politics. You know, he says liberalism has nothing to say to Joe Sixpack. It's all about the rights of minorities. So yeah, I would say key thing now is to restate liberalism more inclusively, more about the role of the state. And I think this is really what America has to, well, all of us actually in the West, about coming to grips with the role of the state in a pluralistic post-Christian society.
I don't know when you get permission to speak.
Thank you so much.
Part of our problem is, of course, that these words mean so many different things over time and changing historical context. And one of the most dramatic legacies of Reconstruction was that the federal government became the authority that enforced measures designed for social justice, and states' rights became the argument behind which a great deal of racist organization hid.
That's right.
So part of it is just these words, you know, and the changing meaning or the uncertain meanings that they have from period to period. I did want to go back to a point earlier, which is about the US Constitution. I'm not in favor of sort of tampering so much with it, because the means by which it is revised are still there. The Klan resurged in the United States after Black women got the vote in 1920, thanks to the 19th Amendment. So the mechanisms to adapt and revise are always there. Also, I think that the rituals of American politics do include this kind of rhetoric about the social project. And so maybe in a way, people are living the way Black people have always lived, which is with two ideas in America. There's what's happening now, and there's where you want to get to. And the two are very related and can't be separated. And I think that this kind of having to hold two ideas at once, this double consciousness, is now something we all have and all share. And maybe that's part of what makes the identification with Black Lives Matter that much more intense now. Also, to the young lady, I must say that in the 60s, those protesters were very young. They were as young as the ones now, because they were the ones who would risk everything. Whereas a lot of people in various communities, especially in the South, had far too much to lose. So it was the young who went to the sit-ins and that were on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So that's always been a part of modern. The mass character of civil rights comes from it being a youth movement.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Can we just want to go to Patrick again, because you raised an interesting point in the chat, Patrick, I thought, which is, you know, a semantic, but also a kind of a value issue, which is this word liberalism and its multiple meanings. Can you kind of give us a you know, a kind of boot camp in the various meanings of the word in this context?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Daryl just referred to it as well, I think, and this came from a comment by Xavier Greenwood earlier in the discussion, where I saw he sort of eluded, if you like, liberalism and neoliberal economics, and this is the problem Daryl was talking about language. I mean, they're two very different things, and particularly in the American context, when, you know, if a Trump supporter says somebody's liberal, that is not a positive. But liberalism from the American left is about greater equality, it's about greater openness of society, it's about greater fairness, it's about opportunity for all. Libertarianism is obviously the antithesis of this, as is neoliberal economics, and indeed I would argue from my own perspective that the sort of neoliberal economic approach that you know, the US has had on steroids and Britain has done a good job of following quite closely behind, as compared to other countries who've had a more sort of balanced economic approach. Those sort of neoliberal economic policies has led to some of the many problems we are facing now as societies, and the growing disparity between rich and poor, and the lack of opportunity, and all those sorts of things. So you know, liberalism and neoliberal economics and libertarianism are two polar opposites, and how we, you know, make sure that people understand and the terminology around that, and so that they're less loaded and clearer to people in terms of meaning. I'm not entirely sure, but we need to do something about that. Thank you. We're getting perilously close to the end of the hour, sadly, but I just wanted to go before we end to Lauren. As sort of our correspondent on the ground, and you know, such an experienced journalist on political ups and downs, and just to ask you a really unfair question, not about the result, because I think that, you know, it's about the one thing I've become superstitious about, but perhaps if Biden does win, let's say if. How polarized do you expect American politics to be during his presidency?
I think I mean, his whole campaign has been premised on this idea that he can unite the country and that he is uniquely positioned to unite the country. But I think, I mean, he was the vice president during the Obama era. You know, Republicans actively blocked judicial nominees, and you know, I mean, just the obstinance. It's somewhat shocking that Biden still has this idea of bipartisanship and believes in his ability to reach across the aisle. I think a couple of things will make a difference. I'll be quick. I think if Biden wins by, you know, I mean, maybe not a landslide, but if he wins clearly and outright, and there's less of a drawn out fight after the election, perhaps it will be easier. I think if it's narrow, and, you know, there's legal challenges, hopefully not, but possibly violence, I think that becomes, I don't know where you pick up after that. And that will be the task of his presidency. But I think, you know, already you're seeing it, Congress won't pass aid for a new version of aid for the coronavirus. And that's because they don't want to revive the economy that they expect Joe Biden to inherit. So I think that's just a taste of the fights you're going to see. And, you know, Biden is ever optimistic that that his buddies in the Senate will still be his buddies when he's president. I am less so, but, you know, possibly he is that sort of genial, avuncular type that can reach across the aisle, and maybe for the next 4 years, that's what America needs, and will help bring these two sides together. So possibly, but we're already seeing Republicans lay the groundwork. Yeah.
Possibly it's better than not at all. Sadly, we have run out of time, and I just want to really very quickly whisk through some of the salient points, which is very difficult because there have been, I mean, I have pages of notes here. Patrick said so many fascinating things, and I was particularly struck by his call to America to acknowledge that it's no longer a young country, and to acknowledge the challenges that come with that. Also by Lauren's point about Trump seeing the dream as a zero-sum game, I thought was a very striking way of looking at it. And then with Carol, so many brilliant points, and amongst them, and governing them in a way, the kind of the decline and challenges that have faced liberalism over the decades, and the need to reconstitute, re-understand that. But just because it seems appropriate, especially in the light of what Lauren just said, to take the point made variously by her and Emma and others that there have been during this presidency some very extraordinary signs and insurgencies and activisms, starting with the Women's March, Me Too, BLM, and others, that have really displayed the fact that even if there isn't a unitary American dream, there are still people who will constantly want to redefine it and re-energize it, which certainly gives me a sense of hope that, that whatever else happens, that the dream is not dead, which is consoling, even if one has to lace that with a heavy dose of realism of the challenges ahead. Those of us that love America, love Americans, and love being there and going there and experiencing it, and something we can't do at the moment, but look forward to doing again. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, very warm thanks to our brilliant speakers, Lauren, Patrick, and Daryl. Thank you to our partner, Santander, and thank you all for attending, and have a tremendous afternoon and weekend. Bye for now.